Okay, so here is a true story that plays out all over America every day. For thousands of years, in every civilized society, the elderly have been permitted to die in their homes, in the bosom of the family that loved them and that they loved. People figured that it was the least they could do for the generation that raised them and gave them care and comfort and life and hope. It has been a relatively short time since Western society embarked on the great industrial experiment. I would like to tell you a story of how our philosophy and how the things that we think and believe ultimately affect us and our destinations. When my grandmother was a young girl, her life was not much different than that of little girls 500 years before she was born in 1909. In 1909, there were motor cars, but most people, except those in large eastern cities, had never even seen a car. By contrast, almost all travel in 1909 in rural America was by the way of horsepower, just as it had been around the world for most of the preceding millennia. Most of my grandmother's food was grown by her family, and it was cooked in wood stoves and later in gas stoves, but not until after 1922 when gas appliances became more common. She did not have running water or indoor plumbing. Life in the early 20th century for most people was not remarkably different than life in the 15th century, although things were about to change and very, very fast. Rural people lived lives of relative freedom in America in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Most people owned their own land, or they worked as tenant farmers for a landowner. Whatever a family needed that they didn't provide for themselves, they purchased, traded, or bartered from others who had what was needed. The people were not yet enslaved to the tyranny of large urban markets, nor manipulated by the whims of the consumer economy. Sadly, my grandmother and her family did not even know how free they really were, because they had not yet had a glimpse of the slavery that modernism would bring, nor were they aware of all that the new industrialism would cost them. So, in order for industrialism to take root, an intensive period of colonization and brainwashing was necessary. Remember, by 1909, the rise of supercities was well on its way, and eastern population centers were bursting at the seams with workers who needed jobs because they no longer provided for themselves. There was capital and there was labor. What was needed was consumers. Have you ever thought of the word needy? Jesus said that man only needed food, water, and clothing. We might even stretch that to mean shelter, but it was the urban masses, the bankers, and the industrial elite who were needy. They needed suckers, aka consumers, to buy things that they didn't yet know they needed. After all, what is it to be poor? Advertising agencies would be enlisted to vividly portray the ease and comfort of the good life, and of course, anything short of the good life equaled poverty. In the Bible, the poor were widows, orphans, and those who, because of some infirmity or affliction, were forced to beg for food. The word poor didn't come into modern usage until the Industrial Revolution by way of advertising, marketing, merchandising, and consumerism. It was the marketing ploy to create covetousness and a consumer mentality. It was unthinkable that someone would not embrace and rush out to purchase these things. The comment from most people who first come upon this philosophy is, I don't think I can live without all the comforts of this world. I just wouldn't make it. Which is to say, I'm more unviable and weaker than 99.9% of the 100 billion souls who lived on this planet before all the modern inventions. My grandmother's generation was told that all the new things and ideas that were coming would be good for them and would free them from the hard labor to a comfortable life devoid of stress and turmoil. Now, if you have become convinced you are poor, why would you not sign on to a philosophy that had as one of its main tenets the abolition of poverty? Why not grasp and hold a worldview that enthrones the idols of leisure time and endless entertainment? In 4 generations, our family, like most families in America, went from a family with the skills to provide almost all of the staples and necessities of life to one that relied on the world and its corrupt system to provide everything for them. In 4 generations, our family went from a family of producers and free men to a family of consumers and slaves. In 4 generations, we went from being a nation of large, strong, patriarchal, nuclear families to a nation of fractured, broken, and unnatural families of disconnected individuals with no historical undertaking or memory. The failure of the industrial experiment is one of the most evident but unspoken and unrecognized truths in our culture. Anyways, back to our story. My grandmother died blind and lonely in a nursing home. Her last year was a sad exit from a world that had sold her all of these lies. This is a story that no one wants to talk about and that people would love to deny. But it is one that is repeated millions of times a year. One of my clearest memories of my grandmother's final year was a random and frightened phone calls from her in the middle of the night or throughout the day. She wasn't just calling me, she was calling anybody. Actually, she was calling a concept of family and of comfort and love that she had once known, but that the industrial society had killed, but she couldn't have known that that was what she was doing. Usually, she was frightened and mumbling to herself, praying that someone, anyone, would come get her and talk to her, or maybe take her out of that place. Her mind was mostly gone, sure, but somehow I know she knew what was happening to her. And don't get me wrong, her children loved her and wanted only the best for her, at least the best of what they knew. They only acted according to the training they had received from the society that had colonized them. Her children were trapped in the modern system and were exhausting themselves on the treadmill of achievement, debt, comfort, and status. They didn't have the time to care for an old, blind, helpless woman and keep their own sustenance system afloat. But good news for the family. The industrial world had conceived of a solution. The nursing home, or the adult care facility, or the senior care home, or whatever you want to call it. Specialization is king. Of course, everything she owned of value, including her home, would need to be sold off to pay the nursing home fees. I guess it is wrong to call such a place a nursing home. Some nursing goes on, but it is certainly not a home. It is the island of unwanted toys, only for people who have outlived their usefulness. She did what she was told. She raised her family, worshipped her God, and ultimately she believed the lies of a culture that didn't care one whit about her except for what service she could perform for the benefit of the great society. At one time, my grandmother could have been called an agrarian. She raised a garden, cooked on a wood-burning stove, knitted and sewed. She was a product of her time. The world believed that people should leave the farms and the land and go to the city. They taught her that she used to be poor, so she bought a car, even though she had no need for a car. They taught her she used to be poor, so she got electricity, even though she had lived her whole life up until that time happily without it. They taught her that she used to be poor, so she moved on up in the world. She got all of the modern gadgets that the world told her she should have just to prove that she wasn't poor anymore. She raised her children, saw them educated and married off, and played with her grandchildren. Her family played by the rules, and they have reaped the temporal rewards. Now, they all feed the same machine, and they can't see their way out of it, nor would they want to, because, after all, they all used to be poor. And who would want to go back to that? All of their lives, they have been taught that the worst thing in the world is to be poor. So, they each sell their lives as cheap fuel for the industrial machine. And why? Because Mama used to be poor. And as their families continue to fragment and scatter, most of their stories will be forgotten. It's the nature of a fragmented society. People aren't stories, they are cogs in a machine. Let's be clear. I'm not saying to blame the people who fell for the trappings of industrialism. They didn't know any better, although a thorough study of the Bible and of history might have taught them differently. It's up to the new generation to make the changes to save the family unit. Well, that's it for now. Leave a comment below if your family fell for these traps as well. And remember, a simple life is a beautiful life.